Today, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky visits the UK. He'll meet the Prime Minister and the King. This is Politics Live. Joining me today, Conservative MP Alex Shelbrooke, the Labour Mayor of West Yorkshire, Tracy Brabin, former leader of the Scottish Labour Party, Kezia Dugdale, and Mo Hussein, a former advisor to the Conservative government. On the programme, Ukraine's President Zelensky has touched down in the UK. He'll meet the Prime Minister shortly and address Parliament later.
Behind a public appearance of propriety and trustworthiness, you took monstrous advantage of women drawn into intimate relationships with you.
Former Metropolitan Police Officer David Carrick will serve at least another 30 years in prison for his horrific crimes. But is it long enough?
No new oil! No new oil!
This sort of slow protest won't be banned after the government is defeated in the Lords.
I think it's astonishing that we're proposing in this country the sort of thing that we would denounce if the Chinese Communist Party were doing it in Hong Kong.
The government wants over 50s to fill vacancies in the workforce. This man tells us why he has no intention of returning to work. And live at noon, Rishi Sunak takes Prime Minister's questions with his newly reshuffled cabinet alongside him. So, as you've heard, President Volodymyr Zelensky has touched down in the UK in a somewhat surprising visit. Let's show you this tweet from the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, who was there to greet him as he landed. Welcome to the UK, President Zelensky. He'll be addressing Parliament a little later on and meeting the King. You can see there the red carpet being laid out for his visit to Number 10. We'll be talking to our correspondent who will be there in just a few minutes' time. So that's President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine, and a surprise visit, the first time he's been physically here in the UK since the invasion of his country by Russia. We're going to start, though, with this. The Daily Telegraph headline: Met Police rapist David Carrick's lenient sentence to be reviewed. Attorney General intervenes after predator police officer avoids whole life prison tariff. Yes, this is the story that the Attorney General, Victoria Prentice, is referring the case to what's called the unduly lenient sentencing scheme after receiving multiple requests. This is because David Carrick was sentenced to a minimum term of 32 years. He served 2 of those already on remand rather than a whole life term. What would you like to see happen?
Whole life indeterminate term. I mean, look, we're dealing with what's fundamentally an evil individual, an exceptionally evil individual. And we have seen evil individuals get indeterminate sentences, and it's always because they've committed a murder. But what this man did to these women has destroyed their lives as much as any murderer would destroy somebody's life.
And it is about not qualifying for that whole life term in terms of the horrific crimes he's committed, but as Alex said, not murdering somebody.
Well, certainly the judge has done as much as she could. And I agree with Alex, that full life term seems appropriate. But the people that came forward, how brave of them. To call out a predator, sexual predator, hiding in plain sight in a police uniform. I think the sentencing review needs to happen at speed. Government have been sat on that. We need clarification about these cases. You can't have them individually being challenged. We need to have something in place that will reflect the seriousness of this situation.
Do you agree with that there needs to be something in place to refer to all these kinds of cases, or they should be dealt with individually?
I think you need the processes in place, but what's disturbing about this case is not necessarily the 30 years and the shortage of that sentence. It's the fact he committed these offences over 17 years and wasn't caught before now.
And a serving police officer.
A serving police officer. That is the most gratuitous abuse of power from one of the highest offices in the land. This is a guy who was policing the estate that people around this table walk every day that's supposed to be safe, and he's abusing that power. That's the shocking thing about this case.
Mo?
Yeah, I agree. He's one of the worst sex offenders in the country, and it's using his position where he's meant to be keeping people safe to do the worse than the opposite. It's the abuse of power, and I think looking at that collectively is something. We've already had the Wayne Couzens case, so there is a pattern, I'm afraid, emerging here that does need to be looked at again.
All right, well, we said that we would cover President Zelensky's visit. We're going to go to Downing Street now and talk to the BBC's political correspondent Leila Nathu. Leila, how important is this visit by the Ukrainian president?
Well, I think it's hugely significant that President Zelensky is going to be here on UK soil. He is only his second trip outside of Ukraine since the invasion started, and the fact that he has chosen the UK to be his second destination is a sign of, I think, how highly he regards the UK in terms of importance as an ally. You've heard Rishi Sunak's words around this visit, describing it as an unbreakable friendship. It's hugely significant for him to be able to address both houses of Parliament in person, and I think a sign of his achievement in staying the course, if you like, in charge of Ukraine, being able to make this journey here under what is obviously intensely tight security.
Is President Zelensky asking for anything specifically, do we know? Obviously continued support in the way UK and other countries have, and of course recent announcements about more tanks and military kit going out to help the effort there in Ukraine. But is there anything else?
Well, I think the UK is keen to stress today that they are trying to step up support in terms of training for fighter pilots, for Marines, an immediate boost to military equipment. But they have so far resisted any talk of sending fighter jets themselves. That is something that President Zelensky has been asking for, a request not yet agreed to by either the US or the UK. There is obviously some discussion around this topic. Boris Johnson, the former Prime Minister, making it clear that he thinks that is what the West should do. But I think the visit in itself, we'll have to wait to see what is discussed between the Prime Minister and President Zelensky. But the visit itself is clearly designed to keep up that pressure on the West. But I think Rishi Sunak, keen to stress that he does not intend to weaken the relationship or the level of support provided to Ukraine, repeating that phrase that we have heard so often, that the UK stands shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine for many years to come.
Leila Nathu there in Downing Street, thank you very much. As you can see, the red carpet is there. They're probably going to arrive. We've seen the convoy in about 10 minutes or so. There is also an announcement that's come out of the Foreign Office about new sanctions targeting Putin's war machine and financial networks. I haven't had a chance to read through it, but the first line says new UK sanctions accelerate economic pressure on Russian military and Kremlin elites. That, of course, is also the other side of pressure being put on the Russian president. But what do you make of the visit?
Well, I think the visit's very important because there's a real bond being formed between the UK and the Ukrainians. When I was Defence Minister, I went to North Yorkshire, saw the people who were being trained, the thousands of Ukrainians being trained. We've constructed trench systems identical to the ones which are in the Russian system. And our army is actually learning a lot from their army in terms of battlefield injuries, etc., and tactics. Some of the things being learnt for the First World War. And so I think there is an exceptionally close bond has now been built between the UK and the Ukrainians as a people. And I think that having that shown as the top leadership is very important as well.
Right, as you know, President Zelensky would like more tanks, not just in the sort of tens, he'd like hundreds of tanks to fight what they think could be a spring offensive from the Russians. What do you make of this visit in person to the UK?
Well, this is a really important year. We've got to be solid, and we are shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine. It's really important that he's come. And also to just underscore our support. I know the 700 Ukrainian families in West Yorkshire will be very pleased to see him, definitely. Yeah. And also the people that we've taken in. We've always been very warm, open-hearted in West Yorkshire, and we have a number of Ukrainian families. But I think it shows leadership. But, you know, we are side by side with Ukraine, and we need to destroy Putin.
Right. I mean, has enough been done in terms of sanctions? I mean, I'm not asking you for specifics economic sanctions in that sense, but there have been complaints about the fact that the UK was slow to clamp down on money that was here illegitimately, as such, the flow of money from perhaps some of the Russian oligarchs and the regime. Now more sanctions are coming into play, but still the war goes on.
It does, and Tracy's right, this is a big year because Putin is on the back foot. There is momentum there for Ukraine to do the work that they need to do, but they can't do that without the necessary resources. Sanctions are one part of the picture, but what President Zelensky is doing today is coming with the shopping list. And instead of a drip-drip approach to giving him the supplies he needs, we need a long-term plan to properly support Ukraine and to give them the weapons that they need.
Right, a long-term plan, but he wants the stuff now, doesn't he, Mo? And there have been stories, we did one of them yesterday, about the fact that our defences may well be depleted as a result.
Yeah, and that is a concern amongst the military. And I think him coming here is effectively him restating the case, because it's been going on for a year or so with the cost of living crisis that we're facing here, with the pressures on government spending. He needs to come and reflect to people again who are making the decisions why this is so important. I think we need to stick by the support we have given him so far and even upgrade that if we need to. And when you look at things like the integrated review that looked at defence, this was all done before there was a land war in Europe. So that does need to be considered again, and our approach going forward, including spending.
Right. I mean, has it exposed the UK's frailties with its defence and defences?
Well, I think that there's a certain irresponsibility in the people who are leaking these stories to the press, because you're effectively telling Putin what you think the situation is, and we know that he is he can go a long time because he doesn't care about his people, and I think that that's very important. But if you look at the trajectory,
well, one of them is the Defence Secretary. I don't know if he's been leaking these stories. He's been very open about the fact that our defence.
But he didn't. No, he's speaking specifically about making sure that the trajectory of armament that is in place remains, which is hundreds of tanks, future soldier, a lot of investment going in. In terms of saying whether supplies have been depleted, etc., is not a sensible course of action. The UK is supplying the weapons that Ukraine needs.
And will they be replaced? Will they be replaced?
There is an industrial strategy in place to replace them.
You must be worried about the US General last week saying that the United Kingdom Army was not the first-rate force it used to be. That must really concern you.
It was the opinion of a US General which the Defence Department distanced themselves from, and people will make those. And it's a good headline, but look at the trajectory across our armed forces. We've got the most advanced Navy in Europe. We've got hundreds of F-35s coming. We lead on cyber defence and space, and we have a trajectory to recapitalise the army.
So the Defence Department don't need more money?
No, they do need more money, because that's all part of the strategy to go forward. And that's what the Defence Secretary has been very clear on, because he's saying we've got to have this money because we've got to go down the programme that is in place.
Would you like to see Labour commit to higher spending? I mean, Liz Truss, the former Prime Minister, did commit to 3%. Obviously, she wasn't there long enough to enact it, but 3% of our economic output being spent on defence. Would you like Keir Starmer to match that?
I think Keir Starmer's been really clear that if there's to be a change of government, and I hope that comes sooner than later, you won't be able to put a cigarette paper between the position of the Conservatives and Labour on commitment to supporting what's happening in Ukraine. So yes, that money needs to increase. Yes, the Ukrainian army need the resources that they are asking for, but it has to be done in a long-term concerted way, not just drip, 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 requiring the ceremony that we're seeing today to get the attention required for those decisions to be taken.
And I think we have that strategy in place, but it's not so much in Europe, and we've got a NATO Parliamentary Assembly meeting in a couple of weeks in Brussels. That will be at the fore of the discussion.
Well, let me show you this headline in the Daily Mail. Chancellor Jeremy Hunt, of course the budget's coming up, is warned he risks making British squaddies cannon fodder unless he invests billions more in the army, as demands from top brass for more tanks and planes rise. Do you think they'll get it?
Well, if you look at the briefing ahead of the budget, the answer would seem to be no, but often you see this happen and then there's a surprise or a bonus when it comes to the budget. So I think there may well be some movement on this. It may not be exactly what Ben Wallace and the MOD want, and it may be over a longer period of time. But I think looking again at the growing threats that we're now seeing, it's quite reasonable that our proportion of spend also increases on defence.
Right. I mean, is that the right priority?
Well, I would say that, of course, it's really important that we have a robust defence, but it's also the people that we are trusting. They're putting their lives on the line, and we've seen in the cost of living crisis that the way that they're expected to live as well, squaddies on camps, that some of the housing isn't fit for purpose, families are really struggling using food banks. We also have have to. It's not just about the tanks and the missiles. It's also about how we attract people into the armed forces. That it's a professional service. It's really vital, and we want the best of the best, and we won't at the moment if we don't value them and respect them.
The only comment I can make on that was that when I was the procurement minister, I identified this and said it is an operational capability, and that accommodation needs to be addressed now. It needs to be addressed quickly. I don't know now how my successor is taking that forward, but it was my priority when I was there because Tracy's absolutely outlined the problems, and it is actually an operational capability.
Just to go back to the US general that you mentioned, we don't know who it was. I think it was anonymous, the report that was given. But I think the words, and I paraphrase them, were about the UK no longer being did you say a top tier or fighting force? Yeah. I mean, is that just reality? I mean,
I think it's absolutely wrong. Right. Sorry, I didn't know if Kazia wanted to come in there.
No, I mean, maybe that's just the reality of.
But if it's the perception of the United States that we don't have the capabilities that we used to, and they're our closest ally, and it's UK and the US that are leading the fight against Putin and trying to give the Ukrainians every bit of support that we need, we should listen really hard to that, whether it's a leak or otherwise.
Agree. But it wasn't the view of the United States; it was a view of an anonymous general, and I think.
Well, except General Sir Richard Sheriff has said here that we're vulnerable.
Yeah.
More vulnerable than since the 1930s.
And in terms of land forces, I think there is a huge amount to do. Right. But please don't dismiss how advanced our Navy is, how advanced our Air Force is, how advanced our cyber is. Britain's armed forces are not in the state that perhaps is painted, but there is a trajectory to recapitalise the army, and that needs the funding. And if Jeremy Hunt tries to stop that, I think there's going to be a hell of an argument on the backbenches. And I think that actually it is vital that all the Secretaries of State around the table that Ben Wallace is listening to, because he's a calm, pragmatic man who knows what's needed.
All right, we're going to talk about something different in just a few moments' time, because we're going to talk about the hashtag #MeToo and a fallout, according to a report in the Sunday Times, that it's actually wrecking the lives of schoolboys. You may remember that in 2017, the hashtag #MeToo took off on social media. It provided a way, an outlet for women, particularly around the world, to publicise their experiences of sexual abuse or harassment. And in 2021, that movement reached schools, shared through a website called Everyone's Invited. Around 100,000 pupils published their anonymous allegations of sexual harassment and assault. This is the headline Hold on. We can now see President Zelensky with Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. They met when he landed, but here they are outside number 10. President Zelensky in that familiar outfit, his sort of fatigues there on the doorstep. The red carpet has been rolled out for him, and certainly the press will be clamouring there for photos and interview. They're going in. They will be talking about the sorts of things that we discussed at the top of the programme before President Zelensky addresses Parliament. You can see everyone running up there now, no doubt moving to get closer to Parliament, where MPs and peers will no doubt be wanting to get a glimpse of President Zelensky and also listen to what he has to say. Let's go back to the Me Too fallout. That's the headline. I've been wanting to show you why Me Too fallout is wrecking the lives of schoolboys. Let's talk to Julie Lynn Evans, a psychotherapist with 35 years' experience. She's concerned the movement has had an unintended backlash on teenage boys. Welcome to you, Julie. Why do you think that?
Because the boys no longer really know what to do with themselves, how to do it, or which way to go, or what's right. They sort of slightly don't know what way's up. I mean, Everyone's Invited came in, and then came COVID. So then they were all stuck at home on their computer games and stuff like that, and they were watching too much porn. And I'm such an advocate of doing something to stop the damage that porn is doing. But they came out of lockdown. They came into this quite febrile atmosphere, and they found themselves accused of this and that, and not knowing how to relate or communicate with girls properly. And really, quite often, whatever they do is seen in a distorted and difficult way, so that boys suddenly are being packaged as bad and girls are being packaged as good. There's also a whole new load of safeguarding rules around at the moment, and if there's any idea that there's been some inappropriate sexual behaviour, headmasters have to act, otherwise the safeguarders and the social services come in. And instead of being able to treat some not appalling behaviour with common sense. It becomes very, very difficult for the boys to find a way through normal adolescent experimentation, flirting, partying, whatever.
Yeah,
so
I mean,
boys.
Yes, I mean, it's interesting your words where you say these are normal adolescent experimental behaviour, and I'm sure COVID has had a big impact on preventing boys and girls perhaps navigating relationships in their teenage years. But what are the sorts of things you're hearing from teenage boys when they come and see you?
Gosh, many things. But I also like to put in context, before that, I was mostly dealing with girls, and I heard the appalling things that girls were suffering from. So this is a dual problem. It isn't both. It isn't one's good and one's bad. It's not great everywhere, and we need to do something about it. But what am I hearing? I'm hearing of an accusation of rape, where a boy went up to a place where the coats were being kept at a party, and the girl's boyfriend walked in, and so her way of getting out of it was to accuse him of rape, and it just went on into the police, and he was picked up by armed uniformed police officers outside his school, and had to spend a night in a holding cell.
Yeah, OK. Let's try not to make it too specific in case of anyone being identified. I mean, I can see what you're saying about the scale here, that there is a big difference between behaviour that strays into serious sexual assault or allegations of and rape, and what you might call something that is clumsy, maybe inappropriate, is clumsy. Are you saying that boys are being tarred with the same brush, whatever it is they're doing?
Absolutely, and I mean, the story has been over many papers, and I've looked at the comments, and some of the comments are, boys are frightened to get into taxis with girls, particularly if the girls are quite drunk. And there's a lot of heavy drinking still goes on in order to sort of cope with going to parties. And boys are frightened to get into taxis. They're frightened to be in rooms alone. They're frightened of saying the wrong thing, because at any moment they can be outed on a social media chat and be named and blamed and shamed, and they're feeling that they don't know how to put one foot in front of the other. They don't know how to do a chat-up line in a pub. They don't know how to move forward in normal heterosexual discourse with the girls.
Right. I mean, people will say that there was a really big problem that needed to be addressed, and maybe boys just have to learn a little more sophisticatedly how to deal with these situations when they arise.
Well, I would agree with that, but I don't want to blame the boys. I want to blame the pornography, which I've been fighting against since 2016-15, and people will not address it. That needs addressing. What are all the phones doing, and all the WhatsApps and no time for processing needs addressing. Parents need to teach, but they need to see what's out there before they can teach.
All right, Julie, yes. Sorry, finish your sentence. I apologise. Go on.
It needs addressing, but not by blaming the boys for being bad.
All right, well, on that point, that's a good point to get the rest of the panel in, but Julie, please stay with us. I mean, is that what's happened here, that #MeToo heralded much more openness and transparency, and a feeling that a lot of girls and women could come forward with genuine allegations and claims of having been, harassed, sexually assaulted, perhaps even raped? But that the flip side has meant that there's been a blame culture on boys, a sort of blanket blame culture on boys in the way that perhaps we've heard from Julie.
I don't accept that, and I find this really disturbing, actually. I mean, I think we're just at the point now where women might just have the confidence to come forward and to report, and we need to create processes for that to be respected and for their concerns to be addressed. Now, obviously, you're wanting to be a balance in that process, but that is right. It was just last week that the English Commissioner for Children said that 50% of 13-year-olds had seen porn, and that 16 to 21-year-olds, almost 50% of them, thought that physical aggression was a regular part of sex and that women enjoyed it. What boys are consuming online, from Andrew Tate to YouTube videos to access to porn, that's the issue. These online harms are the issue. That's the thing that needs to be seriously addressed.
I mean, do you think, Alec, there is a difficulty for boys, particularly with COVID, having followed these movements, that they don't know quite how to navigate the sort of sexual relations between girls and boys?
Well, I think that's certainly true, and I think I agree with every word Kezia's just said. I think what we really get down to here is that whether it be in schools, whether it be parents, whether it be society, whether it be politicians, we are still behind the curve on social media, how things are accessed and how things are done. And we've seen the torture of the online bill and how that's moved between the Lords and Parliament. We just are behind the curve on this. I thoroughly echo what's just been said by both of you. And I'm not sure we actually have the answers. But where it does start, and where it sort of came in September 2020, is putting into the curriculum in primary school and in secondary school mandatory education of relationships, about sex. And actually, sex education needs to focus a lot on relationships, more than just the mechanics of sex. And I think that is an area which is now being moved to. But I do think one of the fundamental problems in all this, what we keep hearing in this conversation, is what children have access to, what they can do in WhatsApp groups, what pressure they're under. I mean, there's the bullying in WhatsApp groups. It's a whole world that I think, because of our generation, we're learning how to use it. I sort of hark back to how my grandmother could never work the video recorder. And well, I'm afraid we're sort of in that space ourselves in how these things work. And we're trying to legislate. And I do think there is a major problem in how the legislators, the adults and the people actually start to understand how we deal with this, not that it exists.
Well, I mean, has this social media campaign and movement, though, put fear into some boys? I mean, Julie says some boys don't want to get into a taxi with a girl in case something happens, or maybe doesn't happen, but they are accused of something. It goes on social media and their reputations are ruined.
Well, I'm sure there are many girls who don't want to get into taxis with boys because they're afraid of being raped or harmed. And I think what we have to get back to is actually the facts that every 3 days one woman is murdered by a man. This is in response to violence against women and girls. These campaigns, Me Too, it's been really valuable and really needed. And there may be a rebalancing in organisations and in colleges, but it is work that needs to be done. And that's why, as Mayor, I've been able to lead on safety of women and girls. And there are two parts to it, which is safety of women and girls, and whether that's self-defence or whether that's safer bus travel, PCSOs on buses, CCTV and so on, and safer parks so women feel confident of using parks. But also the second part must be, to Alex's point and Kezia's, is education. And that's why I'm spending substantial amounts of money in relationship work and projects in schools, colleges, bystander training, consent, because that consent programme last night was really good. And the statistics that nearly 60% of 13 to 21-year-olds have experienced sexual harassment in school or college. We have to do something about it.
Julie, you were wanting to say something while Tracy was talking.
Yes, I completely agree. I mean, in fact, if you listen, we're all saying exactly the same thing, but something is missing. Many more men are murdered than women, many more, 60% more. And many more men and boys commit suicide. So while this needs to happen, and as I've said, I've spent years on doing really unattractive stuff for what's been happening to girls in schools, it's becoming so polarised that we're forgetting that the young babies who we celebrate when they're born, something is happening so that by the time they're 14, we're saying, you know, there's something wrong with them. There isn't anything wrong with them necessarily. There's a lot of wrong with quite a lot of their actions, but there's something wrong with us, is what we're allowing. And we need to have some legislation and we need to...
If I may just say that the men and boys are part of the solution, that they are going to help us. They're going to be allies. Yeah. Faced with this challenge, and we have to support them to do the right thing. And your point about violence against men and boys, absolutely. But the violence against women and girls is perpetrated mainly by men. The violence against men and boys is mainly perpetrated by men. So we do have a problem in our society that has to have innovation, new ideas, working with partners, a public health approach to tackle what seems to be in the too difficult box.
Julie?
I completely agree with you. I mean, again, you know, I'm listening. We are all saying exactly the same thing.
We're not all saying exactly the same thing. But yes, I take your point, Julie. I'm being facetious here. Would you like to say anything, Mo?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, teenage boys are not a homogenous group, but there's lots of teenage boys who know what's right and what's wrong, what's acceptable, what isn't. It does go back to education as well, giving kids, both girls and boys, the building blocks of healthy, respectful relationships is key. But I don't think this is about Me Too. Me Too has done amazing things to shine a light on these issues, to make offenders more accountable, to bring back past issues that people didn't feel comfortable talking about before. And I think that has been a really important step. And I would also add that, yes, there may be false reporting, but we should have investigations, we should have a justice system. There are probably more people who are still not reporting anything because they're still too scared to. So this is by no means a resolved situation at all.
Julie Lynn Evans, thank you very much for joining us today. We're going to talk about the government's public order bill, or protest bill for shorthand. It was defeated, or the government was defeated 3 times in the Lords last night. So the bill is suffering quite serious setbacks after key aspects were rejected. Includes things like slow marching that has been used by some of the environmental groups, and also powers for the police to stop and search people if they are in the area of a proposed march. Let's have a listen to the Tory peer, Chris Patten, from last night.
If the Chinese Communist Party, through its quisling administration in Hong Kong, was introducing a piece of legislation like this, we would denounce it. The Foreign Office would denounce it. It would be in their 6-monthly report about the things that have been attacks on freedom of speech and attacks on freedom of Hong Kong, and we would all cheer. I think it's astonishing that we're proposing in this country the sort of thing that we would denounce if the Chinese Communist Party were doing it in Hong Kong.
Alec, do you agree with Chris Patten?
That sensation is claptrap. I mean, we are not banning the right to protest. We are banning the fact that protesters destroy other people's lives by not working through the normal processes of how you do a protest. And we've seen all sorts of things when the roads have been blocked and how it happens. The right to protest still exists. I've been on protests. I did one on Parliament Square when we had the anti-Semitism issue, and I took part in that. The right to protest is not going. What Lord Patten is basically saying is that Communist China would not allow protests, and we're doing the same thing. That is an absolute distortion of this bill.
Right, he might say that actually it's about the aspects that were defeated, which, as I say, is about this slow marching, police stopping and searching people without suspicion in an area where a protest is underway or expected. Or is Alec right? There does need to be something done about Just Stop Oil and the protests and disruption it causes.
Well, the police aren't calling for this. They don't desperately need these extra powers, where a journalist who is covering a march could be stopped and searched. Or if you have a noisy demonstration outside your local library, police could potentially come and stop and search it. It is an absurd overreaction. And in West Yorkshire, we have tackled big protests, and we don't need these extra measures per se. And I think it's about listening to partners and not grabbing their headlines about how we can be more draconian than actually wise words, I thought, from Lord Patten, than China.
But I think one of the problems the police have had when the roads have been blocked is where the line between the civil offence and the statutory offence has taken place. And I think that the bill helps clear that up for them. I mean, Tracy, I can't remember now whether you were here or not, but I mean, just in the local area when roads have been blocked, this place has been gridlocked. And there's a hospital over the road, and I've walked and seen ambulances not going anywhere, stuck up at the roundabout just up the road. And it wasn't given any warning about. There is still... Look, we've seen huge protests have taken place. Protests from, the Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter. I mean, all of these protests happened, but they were in a controlled circumstance. They were big protests. But there has to be a line between being able to protest, show what's going on, but shutting the M25 or gridlocking a city on particular areas. I think the police needed a more defined role on that.
My point
and I think
is
that it's
the police
important.
have been handling these protests
only when the injunctions
country.
were done, separate injunctions. To have it cleared up in statute between a civil and an offence, I think is important to keep things moving. But the idea
how do you change the laws unless you have the right to protest? And as someone back in the day who protested at Greenham Common, I understand that right, that coming together.
You will be able to protest, of course. This is
yes,
about...
of course, but that sort of passion and that
can I just,
original type
what did you
protest.
do when you protested at Greenham Common? Were you protesting around there, or did you block all the roads, etc., or did you show your strength of protest? Look, I'm 47 now. I was a kid at the time. I remember the Greenham Common protest. It had an impact. It's something ingrained in the childhood. It was on the news. And that right of protest still exists.
I think the question is, do the police desperately need these extra powers? And the answer is no.
Right, let me just show you this tweet from Greg Hans, who is the new party chairman, replacing Nadeem Zahawi. It took a little bit of time to put someone in post. He said, tonight in the Lords, Labour has voted against our new protest powers for police. The British people don't like seeing their daily life brought to a standstill in the way Alec has outlined by a tiny minority using extreme tactics. What do you make of what Greg Hans has said? Is Labour in the wrong place on this?
No, I think Labour were trying to help you do your job as a journalist and allow you to report from a protest. The government were trying to ban protests on current issues of debate. They were trying to extend such powers that the police have, which in the current environment around public attitudes towards the police, I think would be deeply unpopular. So I think this is an egregious abuse of power. It's really unpopular with the public because I think the public want to hear their voice heard in the current environment. The idea that you couldn't debate issues that are of current relevance outside the Parliament across the road from here is a complete anathema to most people. It's a fundamental part of a functioning democracy is the right to protest, and the way that we do that innovates with the times. And of course, the law has to adjust to that, but we have a right to protest, it evolves, and it must be protected.
What about the rights of most people who are law-abiding to go about their daily lives without serious disruption, which is what we've seen, where roads are being closed, where ambulances can't get through, property being vandalised? If the means of protest is changing, then I think the government is right to look again, because you have to balance the right to protest with the right of everybody else who is just trying to get on with their lives.
So I agree with that, but look at the details of the bill. So one of the aspects were about banning orders. So I support the idea that you might ban somebody from a protest who has committed a civil offence in the past from attending any future protests. What I don't think you should do is blanket ban people from attending protests just because you suspect they might have some sort of climate change banner in their bag, which they now have an extra power to go and check to see if you have in the first place. That's over the line for me. You can improve the law so that some of the worst offences, like blocking ambulances that we've seen in the past, can't happen again. But we've got to be careful we don't go too far, or we end up, just like what Chris Patton said, replicating behaviours at the other side of the world that we would stand against in any other form.
Really?
I don't think this is anything like China. We have a democracy here, we have protests, we have history of that, but this is about also ensuring that everybody else who is suffering as a result of these protests can get on with their day-to-day lives. I also think it does a disservice to the issues. The issues are mostly about the environment, let's say. We're not talking about those issues, we're talking about the means of protest. So there may be other ways that these groups can raise the concerns that they have, where we talk about the substance, which is valid, and we debate that rather than what they're making it about, which is disruption to millions of people's lives.
Right. But the question is, does stop and search enable an ambulance to get through a protest? It feels disproportionate to the challenge, which is obviously when somebody is committing a crime, then the police have the resources and the powers in order to deal with that in the moment.
Alec?
I just think we've got to be careful about this, because there's been a lot about stopping people with the right to protest, and this bill does not stop people with the right to protest.
At that moment, you've paused. Just at the right moment, we can see President Zelensky and some of his colleagues there coming out of number 10 Downing Street. I've slightly lost track of time, how long he was actually in there with Rishi Sunak, no doubt discussing ongoing military support. We think it's about 15, 20 minutes, so quite a lengthy discussion there. And now, no doubt, making their way from Downing Street, just a short drive away, for first of all, Prime Minister's questions, after which at some point President Zelensky will no doubt be addressing Parliament. That's a big moment, obviously, here in Westminster and in the way we discussed. Of course, Rishi Sunak will be making his way to the House of Commons chamber in just over 5 minutes' time for his weekly question and answer session with Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party. We will bring you any more information and pictures, in fact, from this slightly surprise visit from the Ukrainian president. Before we do, though, The Independent, this headline: MPs should get medals and bigger payoffs. Kezia's laughing there. Says report, exit payments compare poorly with other countries, says cross-party group of MPs. Now, this is a review that's been carried out. I think it's gone to the Speaker, Sir Lindsay Hall, whom we'll also see in a few minutes' time, as to what happens to MPs in terms of any payoff or payout that they get if they lose their seat. We've had a lot of elections, of course, over the last few years. Lose your seat and lose your job. What do you think should happen? They are saying we should be more generous.
Well, I think the report's been put together by a set of cross-party people. I've not read it, so I don't know what it says. But the overall principle is one of MPs aren't. They want to stand again. They want to represent. They may lose. That's democracy. They're not looking for jobs in that meantime. And actually, the statistics show it's quite difficult for MPs, former MPs, to get jobs afterwards, even those who have been in ministerial office. If they've just been booted out by the electorate on their ear, there are those who can make early announcements and plan things forward. So I think
you're in favour of
I've not read the report. Well, I've not read the report.
No, I agree.
The principle of it is having a look
Mm.
at cross-party and going to the Speaker about what the situation is as a whole.
What do you think?
So there is an issue here about how you attract and retain the best people to stand in Parliament across the political spectrum, unquestionably so. But what an exercise in shooting yourself in the foot, that you do all this serious work and then you come up with an idea like giving MPs a medal when they leave.
I think that's probably
the payoff
a bit
is like the timing of saying you're going to give somebody a payoff in a cost of living crisis.
Exactly. Well, all of that to one side. There is a really serious issue here about, in the current political environment, how we attract the best people to stand for Parliament. We take that really seriously at the John Smith Centre. We want people to turn towards politics, to play an active part in it, to be part of shaping the future of their country. What I really hope this report is covering is things like the actual employment contracts of MPs, access to maternity leave, paternity leave, support to be the best employers that they can, to tackle the sexual harassment climate that we know exists in Westminster, so that we treat it like a regular workplace and there are rules and regulations that make it more like a regular job. And I think if we did that, we'd see an awful lot less of the abuse of power that we've seen in recent times.
But I'm not sure it is a regular job, and I think this is where you always end up with the thing, because we don't go in 9 to 5 and come home and leave it there.
Well, lots of you go to other jobs. That's something that could be sorted out as well.
Well, I mean, that aside, we come home, we've all been elected into political office. We know it isn't just a normal 9 to 5 job. We know that actually the civil servants who work for us have far better terms and conditions. We know that we're put out there, and we know we get a level of abuse. And I think that there is a whole range of issues around encouraging people in.
Sure.
And I know that you're trying to address that in
so one of the issues that we're looking at the moment is why so many women stand for Parliament and then leave at an earlier age with fewer years served. If we want to have a Parliament that looks like the country it seeks to represent, let's get serious about why that is. Basic maternity rights as a politician would be a good starting point.
Right.
There's an awful lot more to it than that.
I mean, MPs are on maternity leave now with proxy votes to cover them whilst they're away.
It's very recent.
It's very recent.
I agree. One of my colleagues has got a load of abuse from her constituents saying you should resign as an MP. I voted for you to do a job. How dare you take maternity leave?
That is another very worrying issue that's been going on for years, as you say, the abuse that MPs across the House receive. Do you think a more generous, as we say, we don't know the precise details, but do you think a more generous payoff or some sort of certainty or help for MPs who lose their seats getting new jobs might help attract people into Parliament in the way Kezia said and retain them?
I think possibly around getting some help for what comes next and acclimatising again to other jobs or training for that. But I think rather looking at the end of the process, you need to look more at the beginning of the process. How you actually attracting. Westminster still feels very distant to lots of people. When I was growing up, there weren't many people who looked like me in senior jobs in Westminster. Now we have a British Asian Prime Minister for the first time. Things like that do really matter because you feel that you have a place, you don't feel imposter syndrome. So looking at the beginning of the process, how you're attracting wider groups of people to something that they may read about or watch on the TV but don't really understand, I think is more important than what happens at the end when you leave.
Tracy?
Yeah, I think there's a fair point there about who do we attract, and there were only, when I was an MP, 2 Tracys in the House of Commons, which was quite a win, I think, working class names. But I think it's also about public service. Why do people become MPs? Because they want to serve the public. It isn't about a career step forward. It isn't about I'll just feather my nest and then I'll be able to get loads of consultancies when I leave. But I think there is something to be said for better terms and conditions and also support when you change direction. But having spent 3 decades as a freelancer, let me tell you, in the original gig economy as an actor, you do go from job to job. And so maybe I was hardwired to it. But I would say there are definitely great, exciting careers in local government and in devolution and all the many mayors that we're going to see across the country. So if you're leaving as a Member of Parliament, become a mayor. It's a fantastic job.
Let's have a look inside the chamber. Chris Heaton-Harris, there he is, taking questions, no doubt, on Northern Ireland. Sitting there behind me, you can see the Prime Minister has taken his seat after having a 20-minute or so chat with Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president. Just very briefly, we're holding on. Oh, I think this might be it. Prime Minister's questions. Sir Lindsay Hoyle directing there. We might just dip into the Commons and let's have a listen to what he's saying.
Has informed me that he has indicated to His Majesty the King that he intends to surrender his patent as Clerk of the House in the autumn, to allow him to take up the role of Master of St Catherine's College, Cambridge. There will be an opportunity, much nearer the time, for honourable members to pay tribute to the outgoing clerk. Well,
there is some, it sounds like somebody, a member of the staff and the clerk, leaving. Sir Lindsay Hoyle, obviously, filling the House with the relevant information. I'll come back to my guest for just a moment, because it might be a minute or so to Prime Minister's questions. Just show you this headline in the Financial Times. Treasury bans capital spending by Michael Gove's Whitehall department, which is of levelling up. That sounds a little bit bizarre if Michael Gove, who is supposed to be 11... Oh! Back into the Commons.
Mr. Speaker, I'm delighted that President Zelensky is here in the United Kingdom today. It is a testament to the unbreakable friendship between our two countries, and I'm proud that we are expanding the training for Ukrainian forces to include jet pilots and Marines and ensure that Ukraine has a military able to defend its interests today and into the future. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Slava Ukraini. President Zelensky, we salute you. This year, the start will be made to the rebuild of Kettering General Hospital. Northamptonshire Police will reach 1,500 police officers, the highest number ever in its history, and Kettering is set to become one of the best connected towns for ultra-fast broadband in the whole country, thanks to City Fibre's investment. Together with the Prime Minister's pledge to halve inflation and tackle the NHS backlogs, isn't it time to tackle head-on the doom and gloom peddled by those who want this country to fail? And to be far more optimistic about the many good things happening in Kettering and across the country.
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right, and I'm glad to hear of all the successes in his constituency, especially the redevelopment of Kettering General Hospital, something I know my honourable friend has been campaigning on tirelessly for years. But he's right, this government will continue to focus on delivering the country's priorities.
Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Over 11,000 people have died as a result of the devastating earthquake in Turkey and Syria, and that number is sadly rising. And I know many families here in the UK will be anxiously awaiting news. I'm sure I speak for the whole House in saying our hearts go out to each and every victim and their families, and we must do all we can to support the rescue and recovery efforts. Mr. Speaker, this House is honoured to be addressed today by President Zelensky. From the outset of the war, he has symbolised the heroism, the resolve and the bravery of his people. The Prime Minister and I joined this House together in 2015. We've lived through important moments in our domestic and international politics. But none of those experiences compares to the pain and suffering of the people of Ukraine. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that right across this House it is vital that we all continue to stand together in full support of Ukraine?
Prime Minister.
Well, can I first join with the honourable member for paying our respects and thoughts to the people of Turkey and Syria, particularly those affected by the earthquake and the first responders who are doing such a valiant job. The House will be reassured to know that we are in touch with the Turkish and Syrian authorities and providing all assistance that they have required of us, including 77 search and rescue responders that arrived yesterday and have already begun work. And I spoke to the President yesterday to ensure that we are in close communication. And can I thank the Honourable Gentleman for his comments on Ukraine. It's something that not only the whole country can be proud of, but the entire House can be proud that we came together to stand by Ukraine when the moment mattered, and that we will continue to stand with them united as one Parliament and one United Kingdom.
Just for the record, he is the Right Honourable Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Prime Minister for that answer, because every time Putin has been appeased, he's been back for more. And so does the Prime Minister agree with me that across this House we must speak with one voice and say this terrible conflict must end with the defeat of Putin in Ukraine?
Mr. Speaker, our objective remains to ensure a Ukrainian victory in this conflict. Vladimir Putin's aggression cannot be seen in any way to have been successful, and that's why we have accelerated and increased our support militarily for Ukraine this year. It's a decision that I took as Prime Minister. Today we are going even further, not just having provided Challenger tanks and being one of the first countries to do so, which catalysed the provision of tanks from other nations as well, but also today to move to start training Ukrainian Marines in the advanced capabilities they will need to mount further offensive, but also to train their pilots on advanced combat aircraft. So the House can be reassured we will continue to support Ukraine to ensure decisive military victory on the battlefield this year.
Yes, Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, can I welcome the additional support the Prime Minister has outlined today? I've had the privilege, I'm sure he has, of seeing firsthand the brilliant work our military is doing in Salisbury to train Ukrainians in defending themselves. We all support this work and the UK's role in the international drive to ensure that Ukraine has the weapons and the technology required to defend herself. Does the Prime Minister agree that continuing this international effort is the only way to ensure Putin's defeat?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the House may not all be aware that actually we have continued to train Ukrainian soldiers because it's something that we have done for years before the conflict started and something that we should be very proud of. But obviously we've intensified those efforts. Last year we trained 10,000 Ukrainian soldiers through Operation Interflex. This year the Defence Secretary announced that last year we'll be training 20,000 Ukrainian soldiers in addition to the Marines and Air Force pilots that I mentioned earlier. But the Right Honourable Gentleman is right to highlight this has been an international effort. One thing that is a mark of UK leadership in this particular area is that around a dozen other countries have all come here to the UK to take part in our training programs to support Ukrainian soldiers. Many members from around this House will have visited in their constituencies that effort. It's something that's making an incredible difference on the ground, and I know something that the President Zelensky is incredibly grateful for.
Yes, Starmer.
I think the whole House would like to thank those involved in the incredible training that is going on. Mr. Speaker, before I entered this House, I had responsibility for fighting for justice in The Hague for victims of Serbian aggression. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that when the war in Ukraine is over, Putin and all his cronies must stand at The Hague and face justice?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Gentleman is absolutely right that we must hold those to account for the horrific crimes that they have committed. I'm proud that the United Kingdom has played, again, a leadership role in this regard, being one of the first countries to provide financial and technical support, putting investigators on the ground. We're shortly to be hosting a conference together with the Dutch. And also, one of the things I discussed with President Zelensky this morning is our support for the work of the ICC, where, thanks to the efforts of UK members, I'm hopeful that we will see the first indictments very shortly.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, across this House, we don't just hope for Ukraine's victory, we believe in it. And part of that victory must be Ukraine's reconstruction. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that Russia should pay for the destruction it has caused through the wealth lying dormant in blocked Russian government assets?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we are the third largest humanitarian and economic donor to Ukraine, 1.4 billion of support that we have provided through direct grant assistance and guarantees at multilateral lending organisations. And again, the House will remember we took a lead in imposing economic sanctions on Russian entities, including individuals and state-sanctioned assets. We've ensured the provision of funds here will be put in a foundation for reconstruction in Ukraine, and we are currently working with international partners through the legal process to use those assets to fund Ukrainian reconstruction. Of course, that's something that we all want to see, and we're working with our partners to achieve that.
Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a country, we've always been at our best when we stand up to tyrannical aggressors, threatening their neighbours and peace on our continent. That's why the Labour Party helped found NATO, and why our commitment to NATO is as unshakable today as it was back then. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that whatever differences we may have, no matter what difficulties we face as a country, we in this House have a duty to stand on the shoulders of giants who came before us and support Ukraine's fight for freedom, liberty and victory?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we remain the leading European ally in NATO, as we always have done. We continue to increase funding in our armed forces by £24 billion at the last spending review to ensure that we maintain not just our NATO obligation to spend 2% of our GDP on defence, but also we participate in every NATO operation and remain the leading nation when it comes to contributions to NATO's Rapid Response Force and the NATO Readiness Initiative. But I join with the right honourable gentleman in saying that this House and this country will stand united with Ukraine until we ensure the defeat of Vladimir Putin's unprovoked, unsanctioned aggression, and that we will make sure that Ukraine is not only victorious, but that we bring peace to its people.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Global Combat Air Programme, including Team Tempest, is vital for UK national security and for the world-class aerospace cluster we've got in Lancashire, with many businesses in Burnley and Padiham. This aircraft will protect UK skies, give the RAF the tools it needs for the future, and deepen our relationship with allies like Japan and Italy. So can I ask the Prime Minister, with a refresh of the integrated review taking place, to commit not just to the design and development of this aircraft, but to its production in Lancashire too, providing skilled jobs for generations to come for my constituents and residents all across the county of Lancashire?
Mr. Speaker, I was delighted to announce this landmark international partnership with Japan and Italy in December. Team Tempest partners already employ 2,500 people in the UK, with over 1,200 in the northwest. And as we are making more progress, we're going to continue to invest in skills and technology at the BAE Systems factory of the future in Lancashire.
Stephen Flynn, Leader of the SNP.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And on behalf of my party, I'd like to send our condolences to all of those impacted by the devastating earthquake in Turkey and Syria, and also to welcome the exchange between the Leader of the Opposition and the Prime Minister in respect of Ukraine. We all in this House are united in our condemnation of Vladimir Putin and in our hope for a better future for Ukraine. It will be an honour for all of us to listen to President Zelensky this afternoon. Mr. Speaker, in recent days, the former Prime Minister said that she did not regret her time in office. Does the Prime Minister regret her time in office?
I think they'll clear up which one, Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to all my predecessors for the contribution that they make to public life, and can I join with the right honourable gentleman in saying that I know the whole House will be looking forward to hearing from President Zelensky at the conclusion of PMQs.
Stephen Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, hold on a minute. Let's reflect upon the damage that was caused. 30 billion wiped off the UK economy. Pension funds brought to the brink of collapse. The pound reaching parity with the dollar. And interest rates for mortgage holders right across these aisles soaring. Now, the former Prime Minister won't apologise for the damage that she has caused. So on behalf of the Tory party, will he apologise for her?
Prime Minister. Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, on the first day that I took office, I said that mistakes had been made. But what we have done is to ensure that right now, he mentioned the pound at a multi-month high, borrowing costs restored back to where they should be, an economy stabilised, a clear plan to halve inflation and grow the economy. That's what the Conservatives are delivering in government, and we continue to deliver it as well for the people of Scotland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Burghley House in my constituency is bidding to host the World Eventing Championships in 2026. This event is one of the pinnacles of the sport, and if we were successful in our bid, it would provide a massive boost to the local economy, as well as massive coverage for the UK on the global scene. Burghley has a formidable track record of success, having previously hosted 2 World Championships and 6 European Championships. Would my right honourable friend agree with me that Burghley would make a fantastic venue, and would he lend us his support so that we can be successful with the bid?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we are committed on building on our fantastic track record of hosting events like the Commonwealth Games, the Women's Euros and the Rugby League World Cup. I understand the relevant UK sporting authorities are looking at the location, and I'm sure that they'll be considering Burghley in my right honourable friend's constituency in the near future.
And David.
Mr. Speaker, can I associate my party with the comments made about the unfolding human tragedy in Turkey and Syria, and with the warm words to welcome our ally, President Zelensky? He will know that this country and this House has total support for Ukraine's resistance to Vladimir Putin's illegal invasion, and it is a source of great pride that the British people have stood firm, united and unwavering in support of the brave heroes of Ukraine. Mr. Speaker, when President Zelensky addressed this House last year, he asked that we treat Russia as a terrorist state. Since then, Liberal Democrats have been urging the government to fulfil that request by prescribing the Wagner mercenary group. They are doing Putin's bidding, carrying out atrocities against Ukrainians on a daily basis. So on this symbolic day, Mr. Speaker, will the Prime Minister finally commit to prescribing the Wagner Group, a crucial part of treating Russia as the rogue state that it is?
Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we have taken a lead from the beginning of this conflict in sanctioning and taking action against those entities connected with the war effort in Russia and beyond. With regard to Wagner Group, the honourable gentleman will know that we have already sanctioned the Wagner Group in its entirety, as well as taking specific action against particular leaders, as he'll know. With regard to prescriptions, it's not something that we routinely comment on in public, but rest assured we continue to keep all of the prescriptions that we have under review.
Peter Gibson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 22 years ago this month, a good friend of mine died from AIDS. Had he been tested for HIV, I am confident that with the medical advances we have made, he would still be alive today. As my right honourable friend will know, this week is HIV testing, and I welcome the government's ambitions to end new infections by 2030. Can I ask my right honourable friend to thank the Terence Higgins Trust for their incredible work? And will he look to extend opt-out HIV testing to more areas of high prevalence so that we can help discover more undiagnosed cases?
Prime Minister.
Well, can I thank my honourable friend for his incredibly thoughtful question and express my sympathies to him on the loss of his friend, and join him in paying tribute to the work of the Terence Higgins Trust, as I know the whole House will also join me in doing. They do fantastic work, and I look forward to talking to my honourable friend about what more we can do to spread HIV testing and prevent more people from needlessly suffering.
Dave Dugan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The UK Government's fiscally illiterate electricity generator levy will choke off billions from future investments in renewable energy projects, the kind of projects that my Angus constituency excels at delivering. This investment will find its way to more favourable jurisdictions, putting thousands of green jobs in Scotland and our energy transition at risk. So will the Prime Minister commit to scrapping this environmentally and economically damaging tax, Or will he instead confirm that he and this latest Chancellor know the price of everything and the value of nothing?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, no, I don't think it's right that because of a war, when energy companies are making windfall profits, that those profits should go untaxed. That's what our levy does. It's right that we recover those excess profits from energy companies as a result of the war and give that money back to the country in the form of support with their energy bills. What is economically damaging for Scotland is the SNP's refusal to acknowledge the existence and need for a transition, and that's to support the North Sea oil and gas industry, which we are proud to do.
Mr. Speaker, human trafficking is when you move people legally from one place to another, often with the promise of a job, and then force that person into prostitution or labour exploitation. It has nothing to do with people who come illegally here in small boats. That is smuggling. A third of all human trafficking in the United Kingdom occurs wholly within the borders of the United Kingdom. When I was chairman of the all-party group against human trafficking, we campaigned for an independent commissioner. One was appointed in 2014. However, since April of last year, we have not had one. This is unacceptable. Would the Prime Minister use his good offices to get one appointed urgently?
Prime Minister.
Well, can I thank my honourable friend for all his work in this important area. I'm happy to look into the particular position that he mentions, and I know that he is proud, as I am, of our world-leading modern slavery legislation, thanks to the former Prime Minister on these benches. It is a world-leading piece of legislation. We're showing an example about how to tackle this, but I'll make sure that we have someone in place to do the job.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There are now more than 50% more social care staff vacancy than last year. People are stuck in hospital beds with nowhere to go. In my Bath constituency, the Liberal Democrat Council and our local hospital, the RUH, are trying their level best and trying new innovative solutions to tackle the social care backlog, but the Prime Minister knows that this is a workforce crisis. We must recruit and retain social care staff. So I ask him, will he support the Liberal Democrat proposal to pay a higher minimum wage to social care workers to tackle the social care shortages that underpin the NHS crisis?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we recently announced £14 billion more for health and social care, and in particular, part of that money will go to a new discharge fund to speed the discharge of people from hospitals back into their homes and in their communities. That money is already making a difference on the ground. We can see the numbers of people unnecessarily in hospitals are already reducing, easing the burdens in our A&E departments, and that comes on top of the money that we've invested to improve training, recruitment and development of our valued social care staff, and that will make sure that we can reduce vacancy rates, increase retention and get the workforce that we know we need.
Aaron Bradley.
Mr. Speaker, last month, together with fellow North Staffordshire MPs, I hosted an event, a tea party, to welcome Ukrainian refugees living in North Staffordshire. Would the Prime Minister join me in thanking the sponsors, in particular Alton Towers, who hosted the event, the host families, and all the people of North Staffordshire who've made our Ukrainian friends so very welcome?
Well, I join my honourable friend in thanking Alton Towers, the other sponsors, and indeed all the families involved in putting on a tea party. I know many members from across the House will have done something similar. It's a wonderful way to show our support for the families that have come here. And again, something that the President this morning mentioned to me, how grateful he is to the United Kingdom that we have opened up our hearts and our homes to help those in his country that need our security and sanctuary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Big Brother Watch recently released a report into unaccountable government bodies such as the Counter Disinformation Unit, the Rapid Response Unit and the British Army's 77th Brigade. We're seeing huge swathes of public money being spent recording political dissent on social media under the guise of tackling misinformation. Politicians, including myself, the Leader of the Opposition, academics, activists and journalists and even members of public have been subjected to monitoring by Whitehall officials. This at the same time as we're waiting waiting for the reporting of the Pitchford inquiry into questionable state surveillance on campaigns like the Stephen Lawrence campaign. So can the Prime Minister tell us how much public money is spent on these units and whether he thinks it's a justifiable thing to do in our democracy to spend public money in this manner? And could you also update the House on the progress of the Pitchford inquiry?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I have to get back to the Honourable Lady on the Pitchford inquiry and indeed to give her an exact figure. But in general, I think certainly I on this side of the House believe very strongly in free speech and will make sure that we continue to protect it wherever we can.
Bring it forward.
Mr. Speaker, Friday the 24th of February will mark 1 year of Russia's barbaric war in Ukraine. Thousands of people have been killed. Over 1,000 children have been killed or injured. So will my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, call for a national minute of silence on that day so that all across the United Kingdom, the people here can show their unending support for the people of Ukraine?
Minister.
Well, can I thank my honourable friend for all the work that she has done in her previous roles to ensure that we provide appropriate support to those in Ukraine. I thank her very much for her suggestion. I'm sure it's something that we are considering as we speak, and there will be many other ways that we can mark that moment, not least as an international community continuing to show united condemnation and isolation of Russia.
Terry McCarthy.
This week, Mr. Speaker, is Children's Mental Health Week. We know that adverse childhood experiences, whether that be growing up in poverty in the UK or indeed living through the horrors of war in the Ukraine, can have a lifelong impact on mental health. With the number of children in mental health crisis increasing year on year in the UK, does the Prime Minister believe he's doing enough to address the causes of childhood trauma?
Prime Minister.
Can I thank the honourable member for her question and let her know that we are doing more to make sure that the extra money we're putting into tackling mental health is particularly focused on young people, where we've seen a very startling increase in the number of young people presenting with mental health conditions that we all would like to arrest and reduce. That's why we're putting more mental health community support into schools and colleges across the country. That's being rolled out as we speak. And also just the other week we announced more money for crisis centres and urgent treatment centres in the mental health space in 100 different communities around the country, which will make a difference.
Richard Graham.
Mr. Speaker, this country's military and diplomatic support for Ukraine is strong and has strong support across the country. Less well known is a programme that has gone on for a decade, led by the Westminster Foundation for Democracy, to support the Verkhovna Rada, or Ukrainian Parliament. So does my right honourable friend agree that should this country host a reconstruction conference with the Ukrainians to discuss how Ukraine can win the peace, that the Foreign Office and the Westminster Foundation and other bodies can come together to see how we can help President Zelensky in the next stage of his country's development?
Prime Minister.
My honourable friend makes an excellent point, and as we look forward to hosting the Reconstruction Conference for Ukraine later this year, I'll make sure to take up his suggestion and involve all those organisations that can provide support to us and ultimately make sure that we can rebuild Ukraine in the way that it deserves.
Richard Ford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government will want to help maintain popular backing in the UK for our support to Ukraine, including by helping people with their energy bills. More than 40,000 people across Devon live in homes that are off the gas grid. They're on the rural equivalent of prepayment meters. They need the money up front in order to pay for their heating oil and for their alternative fuels. The government announced an alternative fuel payment last September, but people in Devon are still waiting. What will the Prime Minister say to people who are off the gas grid and are waiting for their alternative fuel payment 5 months later?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we specifically considered people who were off the gas grid when designing the energy support schemes that we put in place, which is why the bulk of the support was delivered to those who had electricity meters to ensure it reached people like he mentioned, including many of my own rural constituents as well. That money should be getting to them. I'll make sure that it moves as quickly as possible. But we also put in place the local household support fund to provide discretionary funding that local councils can give to those households who are most in need.
Dr. Kieran Mullen.
Speaker, there's no doubt that the NHS is under enormous pressure across the UK, and despite record numbers of nurses and doctors, workforce remains a challenge. So can I welcome that for the first time the NHS will get an independently verified workforce plan. But we have to think long-term on buildings too, and so in that regard, can the Prime Minister look closely at proposals to rebuild Leighton Hospital, which is a campaign that has the support of thousands of residents in the South Cheshire?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I know that Leighton Hospital has been allocated over £44 million to address some of the immediate issues at that site, but I also know that the honourable friend is keen to ensure continued investment in his local hospital, and I know that the Department for Health are looking at more hospitals to join the new hospital programme, and I'm sure that they will have heard what he said, indeed the voices of his constituents too.
Liz Twist.
Mr. Speaker, bus services are vital to our communities for work, for health, for school and for socialising. But in a matter of days, the buses that millions depend on will face another crisis with the ending of the bus recovery grant, and predicted cuts of 15 to 20% in mileage would be devastating for people across my constituency and others. Will the Prime Minister commit to extending the bus recovery grant so that communities in my constituency and many others are not left isolated? And will he ask the Transport Secretary to meet with me to discuss this issue?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we recognise the vital importance of buses in our local communities, and that's why we're well on the way to fulfilling our commitment to invest £3 billion over this Parliament in our bus transformation, and that includes funding for local councils to subsidise unprofitable routes through the Bus Services Operators Grant, and recent money to help cap operator fares at £2 through the spring. And of course, we always continue to see how we can support bus services in the long term.
Anna Fur.
Mr. Speaker, would my right honourable friend agree that apprenticeships, such as those offered by the excellent South Essex College in Leigh-on-Sea, which I visited on Monday for National Apprenticeship Week, are a great pathway into work?
Mr. Speaker, I completely agree with my honourable friend and pay tribute to her local college, particularly in National Apprenticeship Week. And I know something that we discussed just in Cabinet yesterday, we also have the country's first Education Secretary who herself was an apprentice, and it's something we're proud of.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, can I join the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition in their condolences to the victims of the devastating earthquake in Turkey and Syria? Can I also reiterate my thanks to the Foreign Secretary for the speed of the initial UK response? Mr. Speaker, but as we enter the third day of the earthquake, the bitter cold, unforgiving weather means that the likelihood of pulling more survivors from the rubble becomes less and less likely, and the immediate humanitarian impact is devastating. So can I ask the Prime Minister when we can expect an announcement on what further aid his government will commit to relief efforts, and what discussions he is having with his international counterparts to ensure our response meets the scale of this crisis?
Prime Minister.
Yeah, can I thank the honourable lady for her question and join her in paying tribute to the Foreign Secretary for the work that he's doing. So I spoke to President Erdogan yesterday to reiterate our commitment to provide Turkey with what support they need. Right now, that is search and rescue. She's right, we are in that vital window at the beginning of a situation like this, which is why our search and rescue teams are on the ground providing that assistance. The Foreign Secretary is also speaking to his counterpart at the United Nations to ensure that the humanitarian support that we can provide is well targeted. Also in Syria, where we fund the White Helmets, which are on the ground doing work. We're continuing to be in touch with everyone that we need to, and I can assure the honourable lady will continue to provide all the support that is asked of us.
I'm pleased to announce, as members will be aware, that President Zelensky will be addressing both houses in Westminster Hall imminently. That will require me to suspend the House's business in a moment. Members attending the address should go directly to the hall following the doorkeeper's directions. The House is expected to resume its sitting at approximately 2 o'clock.
Well, that is Sir Lindsay Hoyle, the Speaker of the House of Commons there, instructing MPs as to what they should do, because this is obviously in reference to President Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president's visit to the UK. We've seen earlier in the programme that he was in Downing Street with Rishi Sunak for a meeting, and he will be addressing Parliament. So Sir Lindsay Hoyle, obviously we can see here, there they are earlier, Rishi Sunak and President Zelensky, just before going into number 10, to no doubt talk about some of the issues that were raised by Sir Keir Starmer at Prime Minister's questions. In fact, there was a breakout of agreement and unity over continued support, military and otherwise, to Ukraine with the Russian invasion continuing. Keir Starmer calling for Putin, the Russian president, and other Russian officials to stand trial in The Hague for war crimes. Rishi Sunak agreeing that they must be held or brought to account. It follows discussions about Challenger 2 tanks that President Zelensky has been asking for, more of them to be supplied to Ukraine ahead of what's expected to be a spring offensive by the Russians, and also military training. Let me introduce our guest for this part of Politics Live for the government, Graham Stewart, who is now in the newly created Energy Security and Net Zero Department as a minister, and for Labour, Jonathan Reynolds, the Shadow Business Secretary, Nick Eardley, the BBC's chief political correspondent. Let's just reflect for a moment. It is a big occasion for President Zelensky to have come to the UK in person for the first time since the invasion. There was lots of agreement, as I say, between the leader of the Labour Party and the Prime Minister in terms of, in principle, certainly their continued support. There isn't agreement entirely over the issue of fighter jets, which was raised by the former Prime Minister Boris Johnson. Why not?
He's supportive, Boris Johnson, that is, of considering sending fighter jets to Ukraine. The government at the moment is not. What they are announcing today is that they will help train Ukrainian pilots to fly fighter jets. There's also some training going to be confirmed for Ukrainian Marines. But President Zelensky has asked a few times now for these jets, and at the moment, UK government's not budging on that.
Why not, Graham?
Well, of course, the UK has led in arming Ukraine, the training that has gone on from 2014, the lethal supplies ahead of other allies before the war started. And we continue to lead the way. And it was good to see others following our example on the supply of tanks. But as you rightly say, the government has not yet decided. And this is a matter where we always work with allies. We have not been afraid to lead by example. But we also have to make sure that we support Ukraine in the most effective way for them, and a way which doesn't escalate what is already a very dangerous European war.
Well, that's an important point about not wanting to escalate things. But the sort of language that was used by Sir Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, is about making sure that our commitment lasts until Putin is defeated and the Ukrainians are victorious. Will that mean having to send higher level jets, fighter jets, to help win this war?
It means we shouldn't rule anything out. And the message that we need to send to the Russian regime is that we in the UK and in the West will not allow Russia to win. And if they continue with the war, if they continue with the kind of mobilisations that we've seen, we will supply Ukraine with what is necessary for their victory. And I think the proportionality of that, in terms of the ramp up of the support that Ukraine has received, there is already, I think, a trajectory we can say that the Putin regime must be aware of. And I think it is a different sort of PMQs today. I think that's important. There's a time for the domestic knockabout. I think Graham and I can do that when required. But today, particularly for an international audience, to see this visit take place, to see the complete unity, Labour Conservative, but also Liberal SNP, in the House of Commons, that is important, and that is the message that needed to go out.
And you're right, that was clearly demonstrated today in the House, and no doubt will continue throughout the day. There is another important issue related to this, because as you will know, Graham Stewart, there has been some discussion about whether or not the land war in Ukraine has exposed, to some extent, a lack of spending and investment on our defences here, over and above and perhaps predating the military equipment and training that we have been sending out to Ukraine. General Sir Richard Sheriff, the former Deputy Supreme Allied Commander at NATO, has written a pretty excoriating article in recent days saying that we are more vulnerable than at any time since the 1930s. We no longer have the troops, the kit or the ammunition to defend ourselves. And he says the British Army couldn't even deploy a division with the capability to fight a war within 6 months. He blames successive Conservative governments.
Well, we are, of course, the second largest contributor to NATO. We are ahead of other NATO allies who are supposed to deliver the 2%, and the UK is doing so. You always have a balance, and it is true that I think you'll find in every few years there is always former heads of service, normally former, coming out publicly.
I think Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, is quite keen to have more investment and more spending.
If you're the Secretary of State for Defence, you're absolutely focused on it, and the Chancellor has to look across the piece. We can be proud of the fact that we have been there to support President Zelensky and the Ukrainians, and we can be proud of the fact this is the first visit since the war started by the President to any country other than his brief visit to the USA. He has come to the United Kingdom. That's not because we are a weak military power. We are the strongest military power in Europe, and we have been at the forefront of supporting Ukraine, and we will do so, as Johnny said, in tandem and in unity from the House of Commons until Ukraine is victorious.
Well, Graham Stewart implying that perhaps Richard Sheriff is wrong in terms of the status of the UK defences here. Labour would like, or suggests, they would like to spend more on defence. Is that right?
Well, I think I am genuinely surprised by how much the Conservative government since 2010 has reduced, particularly the size of the army. I mean, obviously, defence spending is more than just the army. Other branches of the armed forces play a role clearly in that. I think what is the right response to this, rather than responding to particular officers or people who do have expertise but are putting a point of view across. I think what clearly is required today is a proper defence review. Now, clearly, what we have seen Russia do, look at the different scenarios how this will end. Unless there is a very significant change in the domestic politics of Russia, there will now be a situation in continental Europe that will be an ongoing defence issue. And I think, if you go back to when, for instance, former Prime Minister Boris Johnson saying, we don't need tanks anymore, that's not how wars will be fought, this is a different situation. So rather than have a kind of populist or political response to this, I think a proper defence review is an unarguable position for the government now to look at.
Well, you say a sort of populist reaction. I mean, Liz Truss, the former Prime Minister, she said she would commit to spending 3% of the UK's economic output on defence. Would you like to see that commitment continued, Graham?
Well, that is not current government policy, and
should it be?
It will be for others. Well, I'm a government minister, and as you know, we speak with one voice. It will be considered, and you have to look. We have this major war in Europe, and it's whether it's a classic Labour thing to kick it down the road with the review, but in truth, we need to think seriously in this new context about what our future defence and security looks like. That's why I'm proud to see the aircraft carriers that we put forward, the carrier support group going through close to Crimea, of course, last year, going to Asia. But we have to have all these things in the balance, and that's why it's so important, as the Prime Minister has laid out, that we have economic growth as an absolute priority, because only economic growth will give us the economic strength to deliver the strong military, which we all desire to see.
The problem is clearly we haven't had the economic growth we need since 2010. But just to respond to your
point
about just to respond to your point about a review, serious defence policy establishes what those defence needs are and then responds to that. It doesn't set a financial envelope and then try and shoehorn those defence needs for a country like ours into that. So I'm afraid I don't think taking these issues seriously is kicking it down the road. I think, frankly, the positions that if I could articulate, previous Conservative Prime Ministers have clearly got this wrong, given to where we have got. I think the right response from you, Graham, would be to acknowledge that, set up a proper review that now reflects the changed situation in Europe.
Well, we had the integrated review, and we are committed to looking again at constantly. You have to look at changing threats, and Ben Wallace has been clear all along that what we do must match our assessment of threats at a given time.
Should we spend more on defence than we currently do?
Well, the one bit I will agree on, Graham, with is you can't simply say, would you like to spend more? Because the economy,
why not?
Because any aspect of public services and the armed forces included in that, the fact is we have had since 2010 very poor economic growth, appalling productivity, wages.
Someone who wanted Jeremy Corbyn to be Prime Minister
just
a couple of years ago. What you'd find is Boris Johnson did want a strong UK defence.
Of course, wanted lots of things he didn't deliver, because that's Boris Johnson. So if you want to go back through the things, the fact is there is no doubt, until the economic performance of the UK improves, you cannot make pledges, whether it's the armed forces or the NHS or any aspect of it, unless you can switch spending to it. But the correct position is not to look at what you can spend and then shoehorn your defence posture into that, is to work out that serious assessment, hard-headed assessment of where those defence needs lie. And as a country, national defence should be and always must be a priority.
I wonder what that would have looked like under Jeremy Corbyn Corbyn, Johnny, who you were supporting.
I wonder what it's looked like since 2010. I mean, look, you've got to acknowledge and be accountable for your own record in government, and simply saying
of the fact
what would have happened over here. That is not an acceptable response to these really serious and important issues.
Right, on that, what about putting taxes up, which is what the SNP actually suggests, to pay for public services? Would you put taxes up further than they are at the moment?
Well, that's obviously a matter for the Chancellor, but you don't tax your way to prosperity. Labour have tried it again and again and again. It's always failed, which is why every Labour government, unfortunately, has ended with higher unemployment at the end than it had at the beginning. In 2010, we saw a 40% rise in youth unemployment over the period of the Labour government. So if you want to have higher unemployment, you want economic dysfunction, and you want high taxes, then you should vote Labour. If you want a dynamic
let's just
economy,
acknowledge, Graham, that the taxes are at a historical level under a Conservative government, and they're at that historical high level because your economic growth has been poor. And
so do you want to cut taxes then?
I think that the burden of taxation, particularly things like business rates and how they impact the economy, is something we would like to reduce, but we'll always identify alternative sources of revenue to do that. So we would, for instance, raise the threshold for small business rates relief, but we'd increase the digital services tax to do that. I do think, by the way, to try and pretend somehow, Graham, this is a dynamic, successful economic government. I mean, look, whether it's Liz Truss or whether it's the CBI...
We've got nearly full employment.
Because there's so many people economically inactive. I mean, people see through it. Even Conservatives don't object to the fact you've got to do better on the economy. The argument is over how you do it. But to try and pretend everything is strong and performing as it should do right now, well, look, I just don't think that's
a lot stronger than it was under Labour. All right. Unemployment is down.
Well,
that's absolutely untrue.
Let me interject and bring in Nick Eardley on this story. We were going to do it actually just before Prime Minister's questions, but we ran out of time. The headline in the Financial Times that says Treasury reportedly banning capital spending on infrastructure projects, for example, by Michael Gove's Whitehall department, which is the Department for Levelling Up. Now, you would have thought that's what that department was all about. What is the story here?
Well, previously, Michael Gove's department could spend up to £30 million on individual infrastructure projects without going to the Treasury for permission. No longer the case.
Right, and how difficult is that going to make it then?
Well, look, I mean, I suppose it depends on how willing the Treasury is to listen to individual cases.
Which is always the thing that ministers and Secretary of States have to do, is make their case.
That's right, but it does just raise this question of why this has happened to Michael Gove's department and whether it's his wings being clipped ever so slightly when it comes to spending.
Or is it the commitment to levelling up in the first instance?
As Nick rightly says, this is merely about permissioning, about making sure that government spend is controlled from the centre.
A couple of days ago, we could spend £30 million.
Well, it's a very tight fiscal situation, and the Treasury has that overall role. The Chancellor has that role of ensuring that we have fiscal rectitude maintained at all times, and that will doubtless be behind this particular process-based initiative, which I hope and expect will have no impact on what gets delivered on the ground.
Let me interject just briefly. We are showing you pictures. We think of the motorcade, President Zelenskyy's motorcade, making its way through Westminster to Parliament, where at some point he will be addressing MPs and peers following his arrival in the UK earlier today. Yes, what do you make of that in terms of Michael Gove's Levelling Up department?
I mean, this is their flagship domestic policy, this levelling up. It took several years to even have a white paper for them to find what it means, and it's clearly over. I mean, you can see...
Over?
Well, if it ever existed, I think that would be the question. The fact that you have a story like this, I mean, you couldn't ask for a sort of more evidential base for the Treasury ruling out any aspirations Michael Gove had in this area. I mean, levelling up, by the way, cannot be what the government have, which is this pot of money, and council sort of bid into it like the Hunger Games for a bit of money here or there. Levelling up, addressing regional inequality is about good jobs, good wages in all parts of the country. That requires an industrial strategy. It means backing the private sector, creating the dynamic conditions. And look what we've got. We've got this incredibly competitive position in the US with the Inflation Reduction Act. We've got the EU responding to it. What do we see? We see business investment, the lowest in the G7 in the UK. You can't address this with these kind of gimmicky pots of money. The department that should be doing this was the department that was split up yesterday, Bayes working with the Treasury. The whole thing is dysfunctional, and frankly, they've frittered away that mandate that they won in 2019.
Quite interested in this, because the argument that the government is making is that some of this money just needs to be explained a bit better. Your policy is to devolve some of the decision-making process to local areas. Would you just give them whatever money they need? Would they have any limits?
We have commitments to look at things like devolution of the skills budget, so you have better coordination of FE colleges in a city like Greater Manchester, and therefore you have changes you do at a national level. We would let businesses, for instance, spend up to half of their apprenticeship levy funds on other forms of training.
Specifically on this
and that's about delivering it
on
better.
the levelling up budget, would you just give... Would Rachel Reeves just give Lisa Nandy whatever she wanted?
I'm just going to interject at this point. You can see President Volodymyr Zelensky there being greeted on the steps by the Speaker, Sir Lindsay Hall. And, of course, we're going to have photos all together. The Lord Speaker, John McFall, there to the right, as you look at the picture with President Zelensky. I'm sure this is a very proud and momentous moment for them all just before they go inside. You may remember, actually, last year, Volodymyr Zelensky did address Parliament. It was virtually. He addressed Parliament. This was while Boris Johnson was Prime Minister. They are now going inside. I'm sure everybody is in place, awaiting his arrival and the words that he is going to say to the gathered peers and MPs. Sorry, Nick, continue.
No problem. I was just asking Johnny whether there would be any limits on spending.
What I'm saying is I think this pot of money is here nor there to whatever levelling up should mean. That where you will address the significant regional inequality in the UK is about backing the private sector to create good jobs in all parts of the country. That isn't what we've got at the moment. This one-off fund, look, it'll be spent by the time of the election anyway, so there'll be nothing there to distribute. But I do think where you're going to have something like this, clear criteria, transparency, shouldn't be about the politics of the MP or bugging money.
So how much more money
leaflets.
would you put in?
I don't think this fund has any future in it. The point about industrial strategy is not just about spending money, although we have to be competitive. It's things like regulation, things like planning. I mean, if you're opening, for instance, an offshore wind farm today, you probably had it licensed 13 years ago. You've got to connect to the national grid and have a regulation. That's what industrial strategy should do.
I was nodding off.
Yes, I could hear you sign.
I mean, it seems to me, and I would say this as the Energy Minister, I mean, what's going to unleash levelling up for the long term? Actually, we have this remarkable opportunity. We see it with the West Coast cluster, HyNet, for hydrogen carbon capture again on the East Coast. We're looking at revolutionising our energy system, the amazing offshore wind, which of course has been transformed under the Conservatives. Under Labour, it was less than 8% of our electricity came from renewables. Now it's well over 40. It's all about unlocking that, and if we can have one of the most, if not the leading and most efficient energy system in Europe, that's what we're building for the future. That is what's going to. That's what's going to help. That's exactly what is going to help reindustrialise the north.
It's not happening.
And we saw in that survey the other day, the UK is only behind China and the US in attractiveness.
Why isn't the money coming? That's my question for you.
I'm going to interject just once more because we're showing our viewers pictures from inside the rather beautiful, impressive Westminster Hall. As you can see, everyone is gathered there waiting. It looks like the sun is streaming through the windows there at the end. Oh, Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer talking animatedly together there at the front. They don't get that many opportunities to meet, apart from across the dispatch box, of course, on PMQs. And you'll be able to watch the proceedings in full on BBC News after this programme, so probably from about 1 o'clock onwards. We'll leave that image with you while we talk about something else. We'll move on from levelling up for a moment because the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, said getting over 50s back to work, as he said in this Times headline, over 50s need to get off the golf course. What a pointed headline that is. A major part of his plans to address persistent labour shortages. The number of over 50s not working has jumped from 37,000 to 308,000 since 2020, according to the Office for National Statistics. We're now joined by David Rawsthorne, who is 60 years old now. Hope you don't mind me saying your age, but it helps with this particular topic, and decided to retire when he was 58. Why did you decide to retire early, David?
Well, actually, I got made redundant from my role working in the tourism sector. And when I looked around at the options for going back to work, nothing sufficiently appealed. For me, fortunately, it's not just about the money. It's also about job satisfaction. It's about doing something useful. And I wasn't able to find anything that really appealed enough for me to go back to work. So I've reprioritised my life and I'm focused more on, dare I say it, ticking off items on my bucket list.
Sounds great.
It is. I mean, I live on the south coast in a very small coastal town. It's bright and sunny here today, and I went for a walk along the seafront at 8:30 this morning, and it's very, very pleasant. So why should I want to go back to work to all the hassle and all the aggro and not feeling part of the work community?
Well, we've got a minister here, Graham Stewart. Graham, why don't you try and persuade David, since that is the sort of government's drive, to go back into the workforce?
Well, I'm the same age as David, so I'm 60, and I love my work. And he identified one of the fundamental drivers, as well as paying the bills. You need something that gives you satisfaction, a sense of purpose, and that sort of thing. So I'm sorry that your review, David, didn't find anything, but you seem like someone of enormous talent. And I would hope, and the government, led by the Chancellor and others, very much wants to make sure we have the right incentives in place. So while people, it's a free country, and people should be able to organise their lives and their finances as they see fit. But we need to look at this because of the numbers of people following David's example. What more can we do to make it more attractive? And we'll do the work on that. And I hope then David may find a job which fits in perfectly with his lifestyle, his obvious array of talents, and allow him to go back to work if he so chooses.
What would those incentives look like to you, David? What might persuade you to go back?
Well, in all honesty, it's not about the money per se. It's about feeling wanted, feeling appreciated, and making a direct contribution. So if there are organisations out there who want older people who have got a lot of experience, a lot of knowledge, people who have been through, like myself, the economic cycle, 2 or 3 times from boom to bust and boom to bust again, we have a great deal to offer. One of the problems that we've got, though, is that we feel disadvantaged by the fact that, if you like, technology has passed us by. Yes, we can use Zoom. Yes, we know all about social media, all that sort of stuff. Yes, we can use apps on our smartphones. But the problem is a lot of businesses now use a great deal of sort of specialist technology within their businesses. And if we go for interview, or if you read the job specification, you read down what they want, and you're thinking, I don't fit this job spec. And if you don't fit the job spec, you're not going to apply.
No.
So
well, let me put that then to Jonathan Reynolds, who is the Shadow Business Secretary. Presumably you also would like to see sorts of people like David who've got all that experience back in the workforce. I think I've got it right. There's something like 6.6 million people economically inactive. Now, it is a slightly broad phrase. They may not be inactive in that sense. They may be doing lots of other very valid things. But just to take that big...
And the reason, for being frank, the employment rate looks high is because that number of economically inactive people has gone up by so much. And the government's going to have to change its approach. It's great to see them recognise this as an issue. Well, stop insulting people, first of all. David's not going to go back in the workplace by being told to get off the golf course. He's clearly reviewed his life and reviewed it. Now, what we need, first of all, there's going to be incentives for David. The government can't seek to punish him, to send him back to work in any way. He's made his choices and frankly, he's going to have to be incentivised in there. So that might mean, for instance, first of all, he might want to go back full-time. He might want to have some greater balance in terms of working from home. One of the many business secretaries I've shadowed in the last year, Jacob Rees-Mogg, seemed to dedicate his only real mission in the job was insulting people who wanted to work from home. You're going to have to move on. Job Centre Plus cannot just be about what a lot of people unfortunately see it as. It's quite a place associated with quite punitive interventions and sanctions. It should be about tailored support. David should go in there and they could say, look, what do you need? Are those the obstacles? And the framework that enables that are things like those changes I mentioned to the apprenticeship levy. Because David probably doesn't need an apprenticeship, but he might need some level of skills and training, more flexibility for that to be spent in that way. Might be the answer there.
Right. What about tax breaks? I mean, I know David is saying it's not about sort of financial issues per se, but would tax breaks work?
Well, you look at nudges across the piece, don't you? I mean, that's as a possibility. Obviously, again, as a government minister, it's not my job to announce any tax breaks. But I think the Chancellor's looking at this seriously. How do we make sure that David wants to go back to work? That's also about change. It's not just about government. It's about culture and business, about making sure that we recognise that we want to control immigration to this country. We want to make sure we make the most of the people we've got, but we have to do it in a way in which they find satisfaction and they're attracted to do it willingly. And therefore, we should look across the piece at how we make David want to come back.
Nick?
This is going to be the big theme of the budget on the 15th of March.
Yes.
There's a lot of head-scratching going on in Whitehall at the moment. There probably will be some incentives for some people, relaxing some rules against which benefits you lose when you go back to work, relaxing some of the tests you have to do to qualify for benefits if you come back out of work. Excuse me. And then this big question of when the pension age goes up to 68, which is proving to be a bit contentious between the Treasury and the Department for Work and Pensions at the moment. I hear that it's more likely to be 2040 that it becomes 68. But
2040. Well, as you say, it could be a big bone of contention. Let's say goodbye to David Rawsthorne. Perhaps you'll come back to us, David, and tell us if you decide to re-enter the workforce and what job you do. But if not, enjoy being at home a lot more. Thank you very much for joining us. Before we go, let's just show you again that wonderful shot and image there of Westminster Hall, the oldest part of the Houses of Parliament. Everyone gathered there with anticipation, waiting for President Zelensky. You can watch the proceedings on BBC Parliament, which will be very worthwhile. And from all of us here, thank you very much to our guests, to Jonathan and Graham, and of course Nick Eardley. And I will be back tomorrow at 12:15. Bye-bye.